Hello everyone, it's Shannon here with Waffle Flower Crafts. In this video we are going to create single watercolor swatches using the 2x3 Swatch Stamp Set. This handy stamp makes it easy to create swatches and record lots of information about your paints. Today I'll explain each section of the stamp and how I collect and record my watercolor paint info. This is the Swatch Tag Combo. It comes with the Swatch Stamp Set as well as the Swatch Tag Dies in the back. They also come in this cloud storage package, making it easy to store. When I'm creating lots of single swatches, I like to mount my stamp into a stamp positioning tool like this MISTI instead of an acrylic block. This tool has a hinge, making it quick and easy to repeatedly stamp swatches. Before I start stamping, I first die cut several swatch tags using the Swatch Tag Die out of watercolor paper. This tag is the perfect size for the Swatch Stamp Set, and it also cuts a hole at the top so you can easily store your swatches together on a binder ring later. I've already aligned my swatch stamp according to my tag in my MISTI, so I can now place a blank tag into the lower right corner, then put a couple magnets on top to hold it in place, and then I will ink up the stamp. I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a waterproof ink. Because I'm swatching watercolors, I definitely want to make sure I'm using a waterproof ink so my stamp lines do not run or bleed when we introduce the water. Once the stamp is well inked, I can then fold the MISTI over and then gently press over the stamp to transfer the ink to the paper. Once I've pressed all over the stamp, I'll open up the MISTI and you can see here I have a perfectly stamped swatch that is ready to use once the ink is dry, and that only takes about a minute. I'll now grab another blank tag, pop it into the MISTI, and repeat the whole process. I'll continue till I have all the swatches I need and maybe a few extra in case I mess up, or to have on hand if I add to my paint collection later on. Once I finish stamping all of my swatches, I'll set them aside to dry. Now that these have dried a bit, I will take a permanent marker and go over this dark line here. This line is used to determine transparency. After we've painted a wash in this section, we will make a second line and then use it as a baseline to compare and understand if the paint is transparent, semi-transparent, or opaque. For an accurate comparison, we need to make sure our lines are the same intensity of black, so I'll be using a permanent marker for both of these lines. Okay, we are now ready to paint our swatches. This is my watercolor palette containing my pans of Daniel Smith watercolors. Daniel Smith paints, like many other watercolors, comes in tubes that you must then squeeze out into pans or palette wells to use. Other watercolor paints come in dried cake form or even liquid form. As you can see here, I'm in the process of creating individual swatches for each one of these paints. The swatches I have completed are stored on this binder ring, which is easy to flip through and find whatever color I need. I will be using a Filbert No. 6 brush to paint in my swatches, but you can use whatever brush you are comfortable with. I find this brush is the perfect size for painting in mass tone and also works well for the graded wash. We will only be painting in these top two sections of the swatch. In the mass tone section, we will paint a flat wash. Mass tone is the full color of the paint. In the second section, we will paint a graded wash. A graded wash is a wash that smoothly changes in value from dark to light. To start, I will need to mix up my chosen paint with water. Once mixed up, I like to transfer my paint from the pan to my palette. I suggest mixing up a bit more than you think you need so you have enough for both sections. This way you avoid mixing up more mid-process and possibly creating inconsistencies in the color. Again, for mass tone, I am just painting a flat wash, so I'm trying to make this layer of color as smooth and as even as possible. For this section, I will paint a graded wash. I suggest painting all the way up to the midpoint of this section with your undiluted color. This way you have enough flat, even color to conduct your transparency and staining tests later. Unfortunately, I still didn't mix up enough paint, so I'm having to mix up some more. And I notice as I paint, it looks a bit darker than what I had before, which is why I go back over the mass tone area so both sections end up being the same value. Just a bit past the halfway point is where I start to create the gradation. I do this by diluting some of my mixed up paint with a small amount of water and then adding it to the wash. I then clean and dry my brush. Next, I re-wet my brush so it's just damp and then extend the paint to the edge, stopping to clean and dry my brush whenever I pick up too much paint. And here's my completed swatch. I'll now set this aside and let it dry before I fill out the remaining sections. Let's grab a new swatch and repeat the entire process for a different color. Before I get too far ahead of myself, I'm going to write down the name of the colors before I forget. There's a section where you can write the name and the brand. So I'm going to write the name for both these paints and then write DS for Daniel Smith under the brand. Now that the paint is completely dry, we will start filling out the remaining sections of the swatch. This G and triangle is where you record granulation, the T transparency, the S staining, and the LF lightfastness. You can determine granulation, transparency, and staining by examining your swatches, but the paint manufacturer also sometimes provides this information as well. However, lightfastness and pigment number is information that can only be provided by the manufacturer. First up is granulation. Depending on the pigment, the particles in the paint can be heavy or light. Watercolor paints with heavier particles tend to separate from the water and collect in the tooth of the paper. These heavier particles cause granulation. Granulating paints produce a grainy texture, like you see here. However, non-granulating paints react smoothly and evenly with water, therefore creating a smooth wash with little or no variation in color or texture. And that's why on this quinacridone coral swatch, the triangle indicating granulation is blank. And to further illustrate the difference between granulating and non-granulating, I created this additional sample with the same paints. Here you can plainly see how grainy and textured our blue is, especially when compared to the coral. Therefore, we will fill in the triangle on our blue or lapis lazuli genuine swatch. When we look at our second swatch we created, our Mars yellow, we'll also notice a grainy texture. Therefore, this paint is also granulating, so we will fill in the triangle here as well. Now let's move on to transparency. To find out where your paints fall on the spectrum of transparent to opaque, you can perform a simple test, which we basically completed when we painted our wash. All you need to do now is draw a second marker line next to the first, then use it as a baseline and compare the two. Opaque colors will be visible on the black, while transparent colors will not appear. For example, on this lapis lazuli swatch, the two lines are basically the same, with the same intensity of black. However, on the Mars yellow swatch, the first line looks cloudy. We can therefore conclude that the lapis lazuli is transparent, so we will leave the square unmarked. But on the Mars yellow, we will color in half the square, indicating it is semi-transparent. Semi-transparent because the line is only slightly hazy and still quite visible. Next up is staining. Paints can range from non-staining, which is where the paint is liftable or completely removable once dry, to semi-staining, where it's somewhat liftable, to staining, which is where you are unable to pick up or remove any of the paint from the paper. To test your colors, use a fairly stiff, damp brush, then gently scrub a section of the paint. Then dab with a towel. Just be careful not to overwork the surface and damage the paper. Upon examining our swatches, you can see that we were able to pick up a lot of color from our lapis lazuli swatch, so much so that the paper has almost returned to its original color. This paint is clearly non-staining. With the Mars yellow, we were able to lift some of the color, making this paint semi-staining. This permanent green swatch is an example of staining paint. The area where I attempted to lift color is virtually unchanged. Also notice how I completely filled in the staining circle to indicate this is a staining paint. Therefore, I will leave the circle blank on the lapis lazuli swatch to indicate non-staining, and fill it halfway on the Mars yellow swatch to indicate semi-staining. Next is lightfastness. Lightfastness is a property of a colorant, such as dye or pigment, that describes how resistant to fading it is when exposed to light. Lightfast ratings range from 5 stars, meaning excellent, down to 1 star, indicating fugitive. A paint's lightfast rating, like its transparency rating and whether it's granulating or staining, is sometimes provided by the manufacturer. I use the Daniel Smith online watercolor chart to learn the lightfast rating of these two colors. Both have an excellent rating, so I will leave the stars untouched. However, permanent green has a slightly lower rating of very good, so I crossed off one of its stars. Last we have pigment number. The pigment number must be provided by the paint manufacturer. Pigment numbers indicate what pigments were used to color the paint. Pigments can be synthetically produced, or derived from naturally living matter, or even mined from the earth. This lapis lazuli paint by Daniel Smith is made from authentic mineral pigments, so I will simply write the actual stone lapis lazuli under pigment name. However, the pigment number for our Mars yellow is more conventional and a better example of what you typically encounter. Pigment numbers start with an abbreviation of their color. I made a little guide here of all the pigments. As you can see, it's pretty simple. The P stands for pigment, and then the next letter, or letters, indicates the color. The pigment number for this paint starts with PY, meaning pigment yellow. Again, I got this information through the manufacturer, specifically the online color chart. Sometimes the pigment number can be found on the actual tube of paint as well. Some paints have more than one pigment number, meaning they are a mixed pigment paint. Permanent green is an example of this. A mixture of yellow pigment and green pigment makes this color. Pigment numbers are helpful for understanding the color makeup of your paints, but they can also be an excellent way to organize your colors. You may find it very helpful to group your paint swatches by pigment color. For example, you could keep all your PR or red pigment paints on one binder clip. That way all your reds are together. I'm still in the process of creating my swatches for my palette, so I have them all together right now. However, once I finish, I will organize them in rainbow order, starting by grouping all the red pigment paints together, then followed by all my orange pigment paints, and so on and so forth. I'll just add these 2 swatches to my binder clip, and that's it for today. I hope you found today's video on the Swatch Stamp Set helpful. If you want any more info on the products I use, please visit Waffle Flower, and you can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook for more creative ideas. Thanks so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.